Hello and welcome to Future Building. I'm Mathew Aitchison and I'm Professor at Monash University and CEO of Building 4.0 CRC. In this podcast, we take a broad look at buildings and building in contemporary society and what's coming down the pipeline in the future. We'll talk with invited guests and experts in the field, where we'll cover news and trends along with research and developments in the industry. Future Building is proudly sponsored by Building 4.0 CRC. Welcome back to the Future Building podcast. We have a treat of global proportions today with our guest, Mark Farmer. Mark is the famed author of Modernise or Die, the 2016 landmark UK construction industry study that we could and will argue has gone on to spur a decade of transformation in the UK. Mark is joining us today to reflect on the last decade, from the commissioning of what has become known as the Farmer Review onto the contemporary UK construction scene. In case you've never come across him, Mark is a regular keynote speaker at the largest international conferences on building and construction, and he's someone I've personally wanted to get to interview for quite some time. Today's episode mixes a little history and a little speculation about the future and charts Mark's global MMC odyssey around the world. To put Mark's work in a bit more context, I think it's worth spelling out some more of the background of the MMC debate in the UK. The UK, perhaps more than any country in the world, has a storied history in big, government-commissioned, hard-hitting reports that have put the construction industry on notice. Just an incomplete list would include the Latham Report from 1994, which is called Constructing the Team, the Egan Report of 1998, called Rethinking Construction, Construction 2025, which was published by the UK government in 2013, and of course, the Farmer Review of 2016, titled Modernise or Die. Following the Farmer Report, we've seen a veritable flood of reports, guides, handbooks on a range of topics related to transforming construction. These reached a crescendo of sorts around 2023 when something else started to change. We'll get into that a little bit with Mark shortly, but a little bit more about him before we begin. Mark Farmer is co-founder and inaugural CEO of Cast Consultancy, a consultancy started in 2016 which is focused on innovative and non-traditional building. Mark is also lead author of the Farmer Review, as we heard. In 2021, he was the recipient of a CIOB President's Award in recognition of his work driving long-term change into the construction industry. Before founding Cast Consultancy, Mark worked at Cardis, and he also worked for 26 years as head of residential at EC Harris. He is a trained quantity surveyor where he studied at Kingston University in the UK. Mark is a sought-after speaker at conferences all over the world, and we're very lucky to have him here with us today, talking all things building. Just a couple of nuggets from the conversation today. Stick around to hear about Mark's optimism about the future of technology in the construction industry, and also his repeated assertion throughout the entire podcast that any change in the industry must be demand-led. I really hope you enjoy our interview today. I spoke with Mark from his office in London in August 2025. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on, Matthew. Delighted to be on.
Been waiting quite some time for this, Mark. Mark, as we heard in the introduction, you've got a really long history in construction. You're now a regular speaker at all of the large building conferences around the world, and your consultancy is working on really important problems with governments and not-for-profits and commercial industry. I just wanted to take a moment up front to ask you to step us through this journey a little. How did you get to this point, and did it all seem logical to you?
So there's quite a long story, I suppose, to particularly the involvement with government and some of the work I've been doing on an international stage. It probably all started about 12, 13 years ago. In my previous business, I was previously in a large consultancy known as Arcadis that you may have heard of, and I led the residential team for that business, and that got me into some really interesting conversations. It enabled me to think at a more strategic level about some of the problems that our industry has, particularly around residential home building and construction. And it led me to write some reports, primarily in terms of thought leadership at that stage. And then that sort of transitioned to a point where I was writing reports for government. And that is a real sort of step change in terms of your ability to influence and to take it, have a much larger stage, including internationally, which I've absolutely seen as a privilege. It's been a fantastic period of my career, very fulfilling. I've made some fantastic contacts, including yourself, Mathew,
Hmm.
and being able to travel all over the world, speaking about stuff that I'm truly passionate about. And yeah, it's been a great journey.
Oh, fantastic. And I suppose I know the answer to this question somewhat, but I feel obliged to ask on behalf of the audience, how pivotal do you think your now famous Modernize or Die, otherwise known as the Farmer Report from 2016, how pivotal was that to this journey?
Yeah, it was absolutely pivotal. It was the key gateway, if you like, to me being able to start having a conversation with government around policy, and being able to influence beyond just writing reports on my company and talking about what were still important issues and important issues for clients of the industry that I've been a consultant for many years, and that was where this whole journey started around advising clients on the challenges of how do you get stuff done in a very complicated, dysfunctional industry. But Modernize or Die was absolutely the gateway, as I say, to being able to talk to ministers, talk to policymakers, and it was a real eye opener in terms of the being close to the inner workings of government and some of the issues where the sort of world of politics and the world of policy, practical policy making, come together. And it was a great opportunity. It came about through me being on a study tour actually in Chicago and Washington in the US back in 2015 with the then housing minister, Brandon Lewis, and it was on the back of that that I was commissioned a few weeks later to write Modernize or Die, and the rest is history, as they say.
Indeed. We are going to come back to Modernize or Die. But before we do that, in preparing for this interview, I did a bit of digging into your background and I see that you studied quantity surveying at Kingston University. I always like to ask our guests how their educational background or professional background, as it were, influenced the path they took or the findings, as it were, that you had. How do you think quantity surveying influenced you?
Yeah, just taking one step perhaps backwards from there. So the idea of working in the construction industry was something that appealed to me from a fairly young age. My dad was in the industry. He was a stonemason, marble and stonemason. So I had exposure to working on construction sites as a young kid, helping my dad at weekends, back in the 1970s and early 1980s. And I got the bug. And the whole idea of, you know, building stuff and seeing your CV take shape on the skyline was something that I definitely wanted to be part of. So um, deciding on quantity surveying as a career was just sort of a technicality, I suppose, in some respects. It was probably between civil engineering and QSing that I had a choice effectively as to what I wanted to do. I ended up choosing QSing primarily because I thought I could see the influence of the commercial aspects of the industry being really important. And the
Mhm.
industry, is effectively driven by a financial model, by cash flow, by profit, not always in a good way. But I saw QSing as being a very central function within a multidisciplinary environment. So that's the path I took. And in terms of my career, um, subsequent to that, and effectively how it drove my thinking for things like Modernize or Die and other things I talk about now, it's been fairly central because I always approach issues with a commercial mindset. So I've been in the industry for too long to know that you have to be rooted in reality. Human behavior and human nature is driven by money, including our industry, whether we like it or not. So the ability to think in those terms, I think, has been really important. I've always taken a commercial and practical, pragmatic approach to the things that I talk about. And actually, in many ways, it gives me a unique insight into some of the problems that our industry has, because many of the problems are rooted in commercial behaviors.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I think it's interesting to consider, and I'd like to ask you the question as well, Mark, that I mean, do you think you would have reached the same conclusions had you gone down a different route? For example, had you studied civil or had you studied construction management or architecture for that matter? Do you think the findings would have been any different?
I would suspect largely not, but some of the nuancing of the messaging, particularly around dysfunctionality and the core business model, may not have been as informed if I'd come from an engineering or design background as opposed to a commercial or management background. I just think the reality of advising clients for so many years from that perspective around, how do you get stuff done? How do you make things viable? How do you commercially, how do you contract? How do you allocate risk? How do you manage your supply chain? Uh, that's given me a specific insight into the world of how the industry is set up, structured, and as I say, many of the problems that we suffer from as a result of that are rooted in the commercial and contractual fragmentation that dogs the industry.
Yeah. Um, So, if my reading of your CV is correct, 2016 Modernize or Die comes out, and pretty much the same year you found Cast or co-found Cast Consultancy. Many of our listeners would have heard of Cast Consultancy in the same way that they would have even seen you speak at many of the conferences. I just wanted to ask you a little about the journey of Cast Consultancy and what projects are you currently undertaking in your business that you are able to tell us about?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, as you say, 2016 was a busy year. So, I was setting up a new business, and co-founding Cast, as you said, and also writing Modernize or Die. So there was a lot going on, and it was all just coincidental. It was fortuitous timing in many respects because the profile that came from the launch of the Farmer Review in October 2016 was obviously good for business. It signposted not just myself, but the business I work for. And we established ourselves as a fairly niche consultancy business, primarily working in projects and cost management uh, fields, and in a very sector focused way. So we decided that the exam question was going to be residential, all forms of residential, from social housing through to high end luxury and all different tenures, whether it be student accommodation, build to rent, private for sale. So we work right across the spectrum, but in a fairly specialist environment, and that's um, been good because actually it's enabled us to focus really, really deeply in a part of the construction sector that has probably some of the biggest problems. So, you hear lots of headlines around infrastructure projects, major civil engineering, and all the problems that go with that. But in my view, they're just big projects that have pro rata big size problems. In residential construction is really difficult. It's
Hmm.
really difficult because of the intensity of effort required to deliver, um, because the actual construction itself is complex. Lots going on in small spaces, multi-trade environment, very much driven by quality. The end consumer is the public. So lots of things that mean that it's a really tough environment to work in. And our business has really sort of grown up around trying to answer that exam question for our clients. Our clients tend to be developers and investors, we've been very lucky from a early stage of our business. We've managed to work with some fantastic clients, including some major blue chip investors, pension funds, institutional clients who are active in the residential sector because they see they're building assets primarily for income. So we do quite a lot of work in the build to rent sector, for instance, and student accommodation where people are building income producing portfolios, and that's got us into some fantastic schemes. So we're working on two of the biggest regeneration schemes in London at the moment. One is at Earl's Court in West London, which is a massive regeneration scheme. It's a scheme that's been around for a long time, but it's only starting to really come to fruition now. So we're just in for planning on that at the moment, and we're hoping for a determination in the next few months. And we're also working on Brent Cross in North London, which is again a similarly sized regeneration scheme, which is really taking brownfield land. Both of these master plan schemes are brownfield sites that have been redundant for many, many years, latent potential, and I'm glad to say Cast are playing a key role in rejuvenating them and building homes that London desperately needs, actually. So it's a worthwhile cause, as well as being able to do some really good stuff. From an advisory perspective, and a lot of the work I do internationally is more general consultancy work, not related to projects. It's more about either enterprise level questions about businesses or its policy support. So that has got us into some really interesting commissions with different businesses, whether it's manufacturers, whether it's contractors, local government, central government, departments across the world. So yeah, it's a really good mix of stuff that we do at Cast, and I'm really proud to have started the business and run it for the best part of 10 years.
Fantastic. I'd like to come back to the Farmer Review now, Modernise or Die. And I'd like to go back a little in time to the circumstances that surround the commissioning of the report back in 2015. You've just given us a little taster of that in letting us know that it germinated, as it were, on that US tour of Washington and Chicago. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about how it came about?
Yeah, sure. So, as I say, I was actually co-hosting a study trip organised by the Urban Land Institute, the ULI,
Oh, yeah.
which I've been quite active with over the last 15 odd years, 20 years nearly. And we were doing a tour of US multifamily housing. And as I say, it was a two-center trip. It was Washington and Chicago. The organizer of the trip from the ULI speculatively invited Brandon Lewis, who was the housing minister in the UK at the time. We didn't really think he would accept, but he actually did, which was great. And he came out not for the entire trip, but for at least, I think it was 3 or 4 days. And that gave me some decent time with him to talk about some of the issues that I saw as being fairly critical to what was then the government's manifesto commitment to building 250,000 homes a year. And I just sort of said, look, if you're gonna hit those numbers, there's some real issues you have to overcome in the construction industry to enable you to build at capacity with consistent quality and avoid just effectively overreaching the industry, as it were. And Brandon Lewis was quite interested in some of that, and that really led to the review in terms of a follow-up conversation back at the ministry in London a few weeks after that study trip. It became a joint government department sponsored review between the Ministry of Housing and the Department of Business. So there was two ministers involved. The brief was to really look at the UK's construction labour model and understand, all of its idiosyncrasies and make some recommendations to government that could form part of the next wave of policy making around house building, and also potentially things that were involved employment and labour law. So that was the brief. So it took 9 months to write it. There was quite a lot of process sitting behind that in terms of uh, editorial review, steering groups, sounding boards, um, but it was relatively painless, and uh, the uh, report was published in October 2016.
Great. I like the move, and for all those listeners who are ever wondering how you get to write a report like this, I think getting the Minister of Housing along on your study trip and having them as a captive audience for that time sounds fairly pivotal, Mark.
Yeah, as I say, it was a fantastic opportunity, one that I didn't really want to slip through my hands. So to have someone there, effectively, you're captive, as you say, in some respects, was a unique opportunity, and I wasn't pitching to do it. It's
Yeah,
a privilege to be asked to do these things, and when I was asked, it was a great honor. But I seized it with both hands, absolutely.
yeah. And look, I was joking, but it's been my experience too that personally, I always feel, and I say this a lot to other people we work with in the industry, that I've often learned most, not from reading a book or a paper or a journal or whatever it might be, but actually going over and seeing other situations around the world. And I think every time I've done that with a group of people, we've always come away with some special relationships and understandings, and we've been able to go that layer deeper. So it is a really serious thing, and I'm and I always encourage our government partners to try to come with us, which is increasingly hard with public scrutiny around budgets. But coming back to the report a little bit, it modernize or die. Well, it's a provocative title, and it's still a provocative title. Um, how did you think it would be received by all of the people that you must have been working side by side with in the industry back then? And did you get some blowback?
Yeah, look, the title was a very deliberate um choice on my part. So it could have been a fairly anodyne, neutral title, something there's a subtext to the Farmer Review, just a throwaway um sentence or just a collection of words that understated the issue. I was quite clear. I wanted the report to be hard hitting. I wanted it to have impact. I wanted it to be a call to arms, if nothing else. And I didn't expect everyone to agree with it. And, whenever you write a report and you put it in the public domain, you're not going to get a consensus. It never happens. And, the farm review is no different. But I wanted people to sit up and take notice. So the title of the report was very deliberate. It was something that I debated with my editorial steering group, which included various government departments who were participating on that. There was a sort of little bit of, we don't usually put titles like that in government reports, but actually very quickly,
I
it was
bet.
surprisingly quickly, actually, they came round to it and said, look, did you know what? This is quite important. It's quite important that, people are going to, as I say, take notice of
Mm,
what's being said. When you put a title like that on a report, then people want to know why. Why are you saying that? And I was very much of the view, and 10 years on, I haven't changed my view. If anything, I've hardened my view that is the position that everyone's got to. That's a choice everyone's got to make. You
yeah.
modernize or you die. And I wasn't really referring. One of the misconceptions is that I was referring to the construction industry en masse, as an entity, and that really was never the that wasn't what I was the point I was trying to make, because the construction industry is always going to be around. It's actually businesses within it. It's in organizations within it all have an individual choice to make as to how do they go on the journey of remaining relevant, remaining profitable, remaining functional in an industry that's got so many problems. So the modernize or die challenge was really laid down to all of the individual organizations that make up the industry.
Yeah. Um, Look, going back again and doing some research in advance of this interview, I have to say it rekindled my memories of having read it for the first time. I absolutely love the list of symptoms that you point to early on, and I think they're worth quoting in full here. There's 10 of them. Low productivity and low predictability, structural and leadership fragmentation, low margins, adversarial pricing. Number 6 is dysfunctional training, funding, and delivery model. Number 7 is workforce size and demographics, lack of collaborations and improvement culture, lack of R&D investment and innovation, and finally, poor industry image. And so, Mark, here we are in 2025. Have any of these symptoms abated? And have we actually moved the needle?
I would love to say that we are on the road to reform, that all of the symptoms that I highlighted that you've just run through there are in regression. Um, the reality is they're not. We are pretty much in the same place as we were at the time that I wrote the report. Um, I don't want to overgeneralize because there are individual things that have happened, many positive actually, that you can't ignore. And I think it's right um, to look at the progress that's been made, and a lot of effort has gone in to trying to address some of those issues over the last decade. But the harsh reality is that at a top line level, virtually all of those problems still exist. You can
Mm,
argue some of them got worse. The one that I was particularly concerned about and has actually worsened, and I think is going to get even worse in the future, is the workforce size and demographic one,
yeah,
because that is a structural issue that it's in some respects it's an oil tanker issue. It's such a big issue. It's also related to things beyond the industry. And but because of the labor intensity of our industry and the fact that while our delivery model is so labor intensive, it's absolutely central to the welfare of the industry. And what we're now seeing is an aging workforce, beyond the predictions that I made 10 years ago in terms of potential attrition. We're starting to see that. We've also had, and perhaps we'll talk about it a bit more, we've had an economic cycle
mm,
overlay on the industry in the intervening period, which has been hugely damaging. But yeah, it's sad to say, but of the 10 symptoms, we're pretty much in the same space. And that really just goes to show that writing reports is not a panacea. And I wasn't expecting any overnight change. The call to arms was one that I was really clear we needed to make. As I say, a lot of things have happened in the intervening period, but if you look at the industry here and now in the UK in 2025, it's not a pretty picture.
yes. So let's then move to some of the recommendations that you made in the report. There are around 10, and they're obviously too many to discuss here, and they're very far-reaching in many respects. So we might cherry pick a few. Um, I might jump to number 3 to start the bidding, as it were. And these are my words in summary, not your words, Mark. So if I've got it completely wrong, please don't hesitate to correct the meaning of these recommendations. But number 3 was really around, as I understood it, how the sector should start to use the construction leadership council's business models work. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the themes of the review, and so obviously probably the most important thing that I've been associated with in the decade since writing the report is the sort of the assertion that the industry should move to more modern methods of production.
Yeah,
And the MMC, modern methods of construction term, is used extensively in that report, and that's no accident because actually what I was trying to highlight was the basic business model employed by the industry, which is labor intensity, its flexibility through subcontracting, it's lowest price driven,
yeah,
it's all race to the bottom, is not sustainable. And actually, we need to go on a different direction, on a different path, if we're going to create a more sustainable industry that can deliver more capacity, high productivity, better quality. Um, and so the whole piece around moving to more modern production techniques was a really central theme on that, and then actually trying to pull the industry out of its quite backward approach, which incidentally hasn't happened by accident. The way that the industry is structured, the reliance on labor intensity, lack of innovation, lack of investment in fixed capital, plant and machinery is not accidental. It's
Mm.
because the industry has learned to adapt itself to operate in a really harsh trading environment. And to be quite frank, the last 4 years here in the UK have been an absolute example of, why that flexibility has come about. Because
Mhm.
actually, when you have a downturn, the idea of moving to a different business model, one that is more capital intensive, one that is more about a factory type approach to delivery in a construction industry that's so volatile and is so cyclical, it turns out that that model is just it just can't be made to work. It
Mm.
can't be made to work without some of the other things that I recommended in my report,
Yeah.
particularly around the role of government, which unfortunately not all of those things were acted on. So we ended up being marched up a hill only to be marched back down again, unfortunately. But the business models piece was effectively really signposting the fact that this was quite a commercially driven approach to how we need to procure differently, we need to allocate risk differently, and we need to physically build differently.
Yeah, look, I love that particular recommendation, and it's definitely informed a large part of the work that I and many of the people I work with have also pursued because it's not uncommon, as you know, if you to walk into a room and you can have a conversation about the workforce, you can have a conversation about regulations, we can have a conversation about the industrialization of building. But most people are not expecting people to walk into the room and have a conversation about the fundamental business model that they're operating in. And, you know, I guess the work I've done and just the anecdotal evidence and empirical evidence of working with so many companies over the years just tells me how fundamental that is to the structure of the industry and the systems that we all employ.
Yeah, and I think, the other thing that is implicit in that recommendation, and it's talked about several times in the report, is the importance of the client in all of this.
Hmm.
So the client of the construction industry is where this all starts, where the problems start. Because if the client wants a different outcome, it's got to ask a different question of the industry. And what's happened to date is that the clients are commissioning in the same way. So they're initiating projects, and then and it's not necessarily the clients themselves. It's maybe more the clients' advisors, the consultants and the advisors employed are unfortunately perpetuating the same problems by doing things the same way. And unless we can change that front end of how we buy construction, it's really difficult to reform from within. There's a push-pull thing going here. It'd be much easier if clients were to pull change business models and innovation rather than industry having to push it,
Yep.
because actually it's not tenable in many respects, particularly when innovators and people wanting to do things differently um, end up not being competitive against business as usual. And it fails because clients are usually driven to the lowest price. So you're back in this sort of vicious cycle of repeating the mistakes of the past. And it's no one, it's not about blame. It's not about saying it's anyone's fault. It's at the end of the day, people, it's human nature and it's behavioral in terms of why would a client want to pay more money unless they were absolutely showing the route to a different outcome. And I think it's part of the problem is being the inability to articulate well enough the benefits case for doing things differently. And that's the bit that's still unfinished business in many respects that we need to do as an industry.
Yeah. I mean, moving to that client, jumping forward a bit here to recommendation 9, where, again, in my words, governments should aggregate demand for new housing into a national pipeline. Is that something that you felt was taken up in any shape or measure?
No, to be quite frank.
Yep.
Actually, it's the one thing I'm most disappointed in because it's the one thing that if it had been adopted and we'd moved to a programmatic approach to house building delivery in the UK, some of the problems we've seen particularly in the last 3 or 4 years would not have been as severe as they have been. Don't get me wrong, there was some great work done around promoting modern methods and MMC and pre-manufactured value. A lot of that was embedded in the policy environment through the period from about 2018 through to 2021, 2022. In that 4 year period, a lot of progress is made in respect of things like the affordable housing program in the UK, lots of devolved government departments in cities, in London, in West Midlands, in Manchester. We're starting to use a pre-manufactured value approach to procurement. That was all good, but the big missing bit was the aggregation of government funded or government initiated programs into a demand led strategy that led innovation, and it pulled innovation through demand as opposed to being a push.
Yeah.
And that's the bit where when the market went backwards in 2022 and we had a sort of synchronized collapse in house building across private and public delivery, it was there was no counter-cyclical aggregated demand buffer. So
Yes.
effectively, everything went south at a rate of knots. And guess what? The sort of nascent, innovative part of the industry was the part that was worse hit because it was immature and it wasn't a steady state. So yeah, the ninth recommendation unfortunately was not properly implemented. I wrote a subsequent report in 2021 with Mike Diaf, an architect here in the UK, that even further reinforced the importance of programmatic aggregated pipelines.
Oh.
But unfortunately, it didn't influence thinking, and we are where we are.
Interesting. I'll have to look that one up and get that into the show notes because I that one must have slipped through my grasp. And
Yeah, it's called Build Homes, Build Jobs, Build Innovation. I
great,
think it was 2021, and yeah, it was effectively just reinforcing that point around demand-led change and aggregation.
great. Yeah, well, I think we've spoken about this just on the margins, but it's certainly something that we're trying down here in Australia at the moment, and hopefully in a few months and or a year, we'll have some work to show for that. I do want to go to one of the ones that looks pretty contentious to me, which is number 10, which is suggests that incentives and penalties could be considered to fund and stimulate industry transformation. How did that one go, Mark?
Yeah, well, as you say, it was the most controversial. It was the one that probably drew the sharpest intakes of breath because whenever you put something forward that looks to penalize a certain behavior, then it's effectively seen as a tax. So, just to sort of explain my thinking, at the time that I wrote the report, we were going through something called the carrier bag tax in the
Hmm.
UK, which was the idea of trying to disincentivize people buying carrier bags in supermarkets because of the plastic content. So the idea was to put the price up and actually, through nudge theory, trying to actually get people to use reusable bags and or just not use bags at all. So the thinking was similar in this respect. What I was trying to actually make the point was going back to this issue of the importance of clients, that if clients were nudged in a direction of not having to pay a tax, even though it might be quite a low level of tax, um, they would have to do certain things that promoted innovation, then that actually would be the client-led initiation of change that our industry desperately needs. As I
Yeah.
say, pushing change uphill is really difficult, whereas if the client's pulling in from their direction, it's easier because everyone's on a level playing field. And but as I actually in many respects expected some pushback on that, and there was indeed a lot of pushback, and the idea of taxing clients for not procuring innovative construction was not something that was accepted by the government. So of the 10 recommendations, that was the only one that was held back, and government said that they wanted to look at different options as to how they influenced clients to promote innovation.
Hmm. And so now that we're on the other side of this, after almost 10 years, not quite, but almost, How do you feel about these recommendations? Are there any in there that you would delete now, or are there some others that you'd want to boost a bit more?
I think the recommendations stand from my perspective. So all of the things that I pointed out, I think um, absolutely were the right things to be putting forward. I think the one thing that's become more apparent, particularly because we've gone through an economic cycle, as I say, in the intervening period, post 2022, we've been in a recession in the UK. Construction, even now in 2025, is still in the doldrums. House building has been very badly affected. I think the influence of economic cycles and resiliency building is probably the one thing that I would probably have majored on a bit more. So, with hindsight, how do you build a more resilient industry that has got the commercial model to ride the waves of, effectively what we've seen of a big downturn? That is where the role of government comes in to help try and smooth some of that cyclicality around its use of public funding, public land, maybe, how you actually encourage public-private partnerships, particularly through institutional capital, to drive more delivery, particularly when the private for sale house building market fails. And that implies more rental property, more built to rent, um, more institutionally owned or co-owned property that is more resilient, has more market absorption. So I think that part of the equation I would have probably spent more time on if I'd had the benefit of the sort of 10 years post the review that I now have.
I think that's I mean, super important part of it is, many of the models that we have rely on this very static approach to the pipeline and the economy, as you say. And if there's one thing we know about the construction cycle is that it goes up and down, and so that's just a fundamental mismatch there. And I think that would be really interesting to read more about that and helping businesses to ride that wave, and as you say, smoothing that cycle. Um, Final question before we move on to the UK experience here. I'm really keen to understand from a general population level or sort of general industry level, what parts of the report do people most regularly approach you about now?
I suppose it's related to what I've spoken about in public for the best part of a decade now, which is really all of those elements that relate to a pivot towards modern methods of construction and the idea of more pre-manufactured value in the industry. That's the conversation that most people want to have with me around, what has that looked like? What are the success fail factors? What are the risks that are inherent in it? What does that look like? Are we talking about modular housing? Are we talking about panels or pods or digital construction, DFMA? So most of the conversations that people want to have with me on the back of the Modernise or Die report relate to MMC
Mhm.
and the physical manifestation of building differently, which is not a surprise in many respects because it was, the I was very clear, and this is something that was very deliberate, and I don't know whether many people have picked up on it actually, is that previous reports like the Latham report and the Egan report in the UK in the 90s talked a lot about collaboration. They talked
Mm.
a lot about integrated process. They talked a lot about industrialization on a much broader level. And I deliberately held back from that in Modernise or Die. I talked a lot more just about the physical manifestation of building differently, which is MMC. So modern methods is a physical reflection of the construction process.
Mhm.
Industrialization is much more far-ranging. It includes the client briefing, standardization, design for manufacture, different commercial models, different procurement models. And I just was really cynical as to whether we'd ever be able to drive that level of change in our industry. So I didn't cover that
Mhm.
in any great detail because I wanted to concentrate on adoption of MMC. How do we get more manufactured value by hook or crook into our projects? Because if we do that, the theory is that we take away some of the site labour intensity, which relates back to that critical area of weakness I've already talked about, which is the fact that we have a declining, shrinking workforce.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I guess moving a little bit more to the broader UK experience, as we also heard in the introduction, the UK is really world class in reporting. I personally can't think of another country that has so many reports racked up that become, if they were novels, they'd be bestsellers of their time. After your Modernize or Die in 2016, the tempo really seems to have increased. And where this kind of interest in transforming construction, I think, reaches a kind of zenith. And so you've already just listed it there in your last response, but for the audience who are perhaps not as familiar with his longer history, I thought I'd just assemble an incomplete list of some of the major reports and landmarks here for our audience. So, starting with the Latham report that you mentioned in 1994, which is called Constructing the Team, the Egan report in 1998, which was about rethinking construction, Construction 2025, which was the 2013 UK government report, and of course, right up to your farmer review of 2016. But then I noticed something that I want to get your read on, Mark, that changes somewhat from around 2018 to 2023. And I'm not being too religious, if you like, about those dates, but it just seems there's a bit of a block. Something else starts happening. There's a flood of reports and a flood of activity, and many of these reports are much more specific than your report. Just a couple of names here that I'm sure you're familiar with. In fact, you probably contributed to several of them. But 2018, it's Procuring for Value. 2018 again, Building a Safer Future. 2020, An Introduction to the Value Toolkit. 2020 as well, The Construction Playbook. Trust and Productivity in 2022. Creating a Productive Environment for UK Construction in 2023. And culminating, I think, in a really interesting book called The Product Platform Rulebook by the Construction Innovation Hub in 2023. So before our listeners turn off, I promise you I'm not going to read out any more lists, but I did want to get your read on this, Mark. As a non-UK audience, where does all this interest and this surge come from? And do you think your report spurred it?
Um, I wouldn't take credit for catalyzing the sudden flow of report writing. Or what I would say is the timing of my report worked well, um, in that it coincided with a previous government's approach around industrial strategy. So the previous Conservative government in 2018 launched an industrial strategy approach to the economy,
Hmm.
and construction in the UK was successful in a bid for funding from Innovate UK and UKRI, for about £180 million for funding. And the Construction Innovation Hub that you referenced there at the end with the product platform rulebook was spawned from that transforming construction program.
Hmm.
So the Modernise or Die was a very useful pretext, I think, for actually the industry deciding that it needed to change how it does things. It needed some help, needed some government money, needed some research into various areas of advancement. And many of the reports that you run through there, including Procuring for Value, the Value Toolkit, and the Product Platform rulebook, was stemmed from programs of activity that were rooted in the industrial strategy challenge fund work, transforming construction. The parallel theme that has also impacted some of the work that's been done certainly over the last um, decade or so has been the building safety debate in the UK, which clearly
Hmm.
post Grenfell has been very high on the political agenda.
Yes.
The Building Safety Act is a piece of legislation that is the ultimate output from all of that work in terms of legislative agenda around trying to change how we build in terms of assuring competence. And that's the key thing around the findings of the Grenfell inquiry has been the sort of risks around incompetent workforce at all levels, from client through to installers on site. And so that has led a lot of the debate in report and report writing as well. So I would say they're the two themes that have sort of driven the interest in writing reports. What I would say um, is that beyond outside of the building safety debate, which is obviously rooted in legislative change, and we have statutory um, uh, documents now that are written down in Parliament that have starting to change the industry in many respects around regulation. Many of the other reports have actually, because they're quite specialist,
Mm.
have have not managed to get the cut through that perhaps that was the expectation. They're sort of quite they're very good reports, but actually weren't rooted in something bigger. And that's part of the issue, I think, that we've had. So if you take, the construction playbook, for instance, which the
Yeah.
whole output there was supposed to be adopted by government departments here in the UK to effectively to make the government a good client. And I can tell you now that by and large, the work in that report is ignored. It's
Yeah.
very rare to see much of that work being adopted on the ground in government departments here in the UK. There's some notable exceptions, and don't get me wrong, there's some good work happening in the prison program, in the beginnings of the new hospital program that probably can have a lot of their genesis in the construction playbook. But by and large, the traditional procurement behaviours of government still prevail in many respects, which is really disappointing. And that as a report was supposed to set out a blueprint for change, which I'm not convinced it's effectively driven into the industry, in certainly the government's DNA.
So if we sum all this together from 2015 until now, the 10-year period, which encompasses the production and eventual publication of your report, we see an immense amount of activity, lots of work going on, lots of groups out there forming and creating this material, new organizations, lots of new companies. Um, but sort of standing on the other side of that, Mark, I feel like we have a mixed bag of results. And I mainly feel that way because I've had the pleasure of seeing you present twice in the last 2 years. And you personally have discussed these mixed results from the UK experience. This has included a lot of collapses of very large MMC ventures, and also what I'm terming, I don't know that this was your word, but I could have stolen it, a kind of backsliding, if you like, away from some of the more progressive elements in that work that I just surveyed, into a more traditional view of building and a very conservative approach. Is this a fair assessment, and can you give us some landmarks as to what happened?
Yes, it is a fair assessment, Matthew. I think the analogy that I use most commonly, particularly when I'm presenting and talking about the UK experience, is a derailment.
Mhm.
Effectively, a lot of progress, positive forward progress that was underway up to about 2022. So even through the COVID interruption, COVID was not a massive problem for our industry ultimately in the UK because the government um, gave it the ability to carry on trading. So, other than a short hiatus, we carried on, and actually, in many respects, it was interesting that it drove some further innovation because the need to work socially distanced increase the concentration on issues around labour intensity and how do you resolve that. So in a bizarre way, COVID was a further accelerant to innovation. But what really was the sort of the damaging blow, if you like, that has done so much damage to the progress that was being made was um, the political volatility that prevailed during 2022 post-COVID.
Mhm.
We had three prime ministers in as many months, pretty much new as damn it. We had massive political instability. We had um, a pretty disastrous budget in autumn 2022, which led to um, big issues around interest rate rises, gilt prices going out, just a general lack of economic confidence, and that precipitated a downturn in the housing market. And it was the housing market downturn that ultimately fed through into the MMC world, where a lot of businesses had set up with a particular focus on modular single family housing and were completely focused on the housing market and it being an active, vibrant housing market just at a time when that was starting to go away at a rate of knots. So that was the real turning point for me. It was late 2022. You started to see big declines in housing output, in construction activity generally. And as I say, it wasn't just private sector. It wasn't just the house builders and the developers. It was actually housing associations, all being impacted by a combination of cross subsidy, which they drive through selling and renting homes in the same way that house builders do. So lots of the social housing providers in the UK have become synchronized into a market downturn, which is an unintended consequence. Many of them were also struggling with building safety legacy problems. They were dealing with cladding remediation. They were dealing with building quality issues. There was a big scandal involving mold and air quality in the UK about the
Hmm.
same time. So many of them had to divert funds away from new build development into existing stock. They were all struggling with build cost inflation as well, which has been a prevailing feature of our industry post-COVID and hasn't really gone away. So all of that led to this sort of perfect storm of a declining demand. As I say, with the modular companies that had set up and were not at a steady state maturity, they were most fragile. They had big money out on the street. Lots of them were heavily invested in terms of setting up their factories, setting up machines, setting up processes, hundreds of millions of pounds. Some of them with private equity, which isn't always the best bedfellow for
Hmm.
innovation because it's
Yeah.
impatient money. So when you had a downturn like we did, it was the writing was on the wall in many respects. And with that lack of that resilient workload and pipeline that I mentioned earlier, it was a matter of time before these businesses ran out of money. And one by one they did. And pretty much all of those startups, or the wave of startups, in certainly single family modular, volumetric modular housing failed.
Mm.
Legal and General, Ilka, Top Hat, all failed. What's interesting, though, I suppose, that's come out of that whole journey is that the route to adoption of MMC in the UK has changed, and we're seeing a different approach being adopted by certainly the house builders, who are taking a much more incremental approach to how they increase their pre-manufactured component, and that's through panelization. It is through simple things like timber framing, but moving perhaps to more advanced closed panel framing. In commercial grade multifamily buildings, we're seeing much more use of bathroom pods,
Yeah.
utility cupboard pods, plant room pods. So actually, MMC hasn't gone away. It's just the high profile modular housing element of it, which particularly from a political perspective, was seen as the poster child of how we're going to change the industry, has proven to not be a deliverable model when you have a big downward housing market correction, which is what we've had in the UK.
Yeah, well, that's quite a story, and I suppose just to close the chapter on our UK experience here, and I know this is a really non-scientific question here, but on the one hand of the scale, or the one side of the scale, I should say, I'm asking myself the question: is the UK better off now for the last 10 years that we've had? Or on the other side, have the problems merely grown to overshadow any progress that was made? How would you level those two sides of the balance?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think the practical rea the reality driven side of me suggests that actually our problems have grown worse and
Mm,
outweighed the progress that's been made, particularly progress that has been completely undone and unpicked by failure.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work that was happening, particularly in the modular single family housing space, would, if it had matured and come out the other side, would have led to true additionality of capacity, because you just basically had new businesses, new production techniques that weren't cannibalizing the existing workforce, and they would have added to the bottom line around housing delivery. That's all gone now. So we're now back to a world where we're incrementally trying to be more productive. But it's tough when actually the prevailing problem that initiated all of this pain and carnage is still there,
Yeah.
which is we have a construction sector recession. Even in the last month in the UK, we've had a big decline in PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, which is sort of a forward look of procurement sentiment, which suggests that the housing market, particularly, is still in a really tough space. But actually, general construction as well, even infrastructure spending, despite lots of government announcements, there's not a lot of it that's actually coming out the other end as real projects. So the sort of the overarching problem is the dominant feature in many respects, which is quite sad, because it's the same problem we've been talking about ad infinitum around boom and bust, cyclicality. But what it's really doing is just reinforcing the importance that it's going to be really tough to change our industry unless we're able to deal with this demand volatility. And that's where government has got, in my view, unfinished business around how it uses policy in an intelligent way to buffer the peaks and the troughs, particularly in housing, where it has a real political hot potato brewing around lack of affordable housing. And it's not necessarily about burdening the taxpayer either. A lot of this can be done through intelligent um, new models of delivery involving institutional finance, as I've said, that builds more financial capacity to build, but actually also enables us to build at a steady state through a downturn, which at the moment we haven't. We've had a collapse in housing numbers in the UK in the last 18 months, which anyone who sees those numbers will not be surprised by the fact that MMC as a concept has been disproportionately impacted, because actually the rest of the market has been impacted as well. We've seen failures not just in innovative companies, but in
Mm.
traditional businesses, some of them very old businesses that have survived previous recessions but haven't managed to survive this one.
Mm. Um, Moving now, Mark, to an international experience as we move to close a little bit. I'm really keen to hear about some of your experiences. A, because I know you are a global citizen and a scholar of the world, and also because I've seen you present down here a couple of times in Australia, and recently I had the fortune to do a tour of some companies in Canada, and it appears I was hot on your heels because you'd just visited them before I got there. I'm really keen just to get some snapshots of what you see happening in other parts of the world. We can start with Canada and Australia if you like, but just a little bit about how that maybe relates to the UK experience.
Yeah, there's absolutely a strong read across to the markets you've mentioned, including yours in Australia, Canada definitely as well. Whether that's a sort of Commonwealth influence, I don't think it necessarily is. I just think it just happens to be markets where the exam question that I sort of asked 10 years ago is being asked in other countries and internationally. It's not, the problems that we have in the industry are not UK specific, they're generic to most developed economies, construction market. So it's no surprise that I see interest in the whole debate about how do we modernize construction, how do we reform construction, how do we get more productivity from the industry, how do we improve quality. All of the big ticket questions that have been asked in the UK are absolutely valid in other jurisdictions, and that's what I've seen in Australia. Definitely, I've been visiting Australia in this context around construction reform for nearly 10 years, having first went out just after Modernise or Die. Um, and New Zealand as well, just over the ditch. So I've been it's been a pleasure to build a network in New Zealand as well, including with their government and having done some work for the government there. I see the same issues, and it is, and I see many of the same problems, including unfortunately New Zealand. Some of the economic fallout we've had in the UK, I'm seeing in New Zealand as we speak. So a
Hmm.
lot of pain um, that is being felt in New Zealand at the moment. Australia is a really interesting market for me. Having spent time in New South Wales, in Victoria, to a lesser extent in Queensland, the state system is an interesting overlay that we don't have in the same sort of complexity in the UK. We have national government, even though we have devolved national government in Wales and Scotland. The state position is a sort of oddity, if you like. Same in Canada with their provinces, the provincial government. It adds a layer of complexity, I suppose, in some respects, but also a sort of a controlling mind as to how you can get stuff done differently. But the interest in MMC in both Australia and New Zealand and in Canada is really tangible. I think there's a lot of interest around, and as quite rightly, in what's happened in other parts of the world, including in the UK, an appetite to learn, which is really important, to learn lessons of what works and what doesn't, and to avoid making mistakes. And,
Mm.
as I say, the one message I leave loud and clear, including when I was most recently in Australia, in Brisbane a few months ago, is change has to be demand led. So the point I've made quite a lot in this discussion about demand volatility and pipeline is so important. You can theorize around construction reform till the cows come home, but you're not going to change anything unless you have the economic context and backdrop that supports it.
Hmm.
And that's my biggest concern, I suppose, internationally, because I see different markets at different points in the economic cycle.
Hmm.
And what I fear is a repeat of what we had in the UK. So it's really important that governments are using their pipelines intelligently. They're aggregating the work that's going to drive an innovation program, and they're joining up their policy initiatives with the reality of what that feels like on the ground. Canada is really interesting at the moment. As you say, I was out there recently, help it again with a government commissioned piece of work, looking at a roadmap for reform and change. With the recent change of government in Canada and Mark Carney now as the Prime Minister, with a real interest in modular housing, I think the stars are starting to align
Hmm.
around what that might look like as a great opportunity for Canada to modernize its industry. And so I'm following that story with interest.
Yes, I think we're all following that story with interest. I think there's some bold ideas being bandied about there, and I guess we'll find out where they go in the years from now. Just before we close on the international experience here, Mark, are there any countries or companies that you think we should be paying more attention to?
I think there's clearly some international exemplars when it comes to manufactured housing, for instance. If you look at it from just a housing perspective, Japan is talked about a lot in terms of its approach to how it builds homes, the whole Sekisui Toyota type principle, is very much driven by, it's influenced by automotive thinking. It's the whole experience of buying a home is much akin to buying a car in Japan. There are some really important reasons why that is sustainable in their market, though, and the Japanese housing market is very different in many respects to other markets, certainly the UK. So you can't just pick that model up and apply it in other countries. It needs a bit of context around land, around the planning environment, and also culturally around the Japanese community's sort of whole approach to housing and what it thinks of housing as an asset. And the relative importance of the house relative to the land, the plot that it sits on. But I'd say, the markets that are interesting ones to watch are ones where you have muscular governments, governments that are prepared to intervene in a way that can really drive change. And in that respect, Singapore has always really interested me. So always had a really healthy respect for what the BCA has been doing in Singapore as a government agency looking after construction. They have very obviously been very concerned about migrant labour dependency. And have been trying to move their industry to a higher productivity um, uh, model, which is using digital construction, is using workforce retraining and reform, and is using off-site manufacture as key planks of a coordinated approach to reforming their industry. Hong Kong is also interesting. Again, the politics behind both Singapore and Hong Kong can't just be picked up and taken to other countries. But I just see it as an interesting bookend as to what can be done if you have a government that has the will to want to do stuff and make sometimes challenging decisions that are for the long-term health of the industry.
Yeah, I think they're all really, really interesting examples, and there's so much to discuss. If only we could talk for another 3 hours, but you've already been so generous with your time that I think it's probably getting close for us to wrap up the interview. Um, this is a really tough question, and I'm going to ask it anyway, Mark. Especially for someone as erudite as yourself, who's not just studied this in great depth, but has actually had the benefit to have made such an analysis as you did back in 2016, and then basically watch it develop for 10 years. So I'm going to ask it anyway, and it's the good old crystal ball question. What do you think is coming down the pipeline in the building industry in the next 5 to 10 years? What does that future look like for you? Are you optimistic about it? Can you share any of the visions or ideas that you have in your mind?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying I am optimistic. So despite all of the rough and tumble that we've gone through over the last decade and of trying to push forward and then having setbacks, um, that's life in many respects. And we move on. And what I see over the next decade is a really interesting next wave, if you like, of potential modernization and reform, perhaps appearing and manifesting in a way that certainly I wasn't entirely cited on when I wrote Modernize or Die in 2016. And that's really driven by technology and the power of technology and the speed of technological reform that is permeating not just construction, but society at the moment. So obviously everyone's talking about AI, lots of, you know, talk as to whether it's a bubble, whether it's hype, what's the reality. But you strip it all back, something is happening.
Yeah.
Something is happening, which is pretty seismic, and it will have an impact on construction. And what I'm really interested to see is how the advent of artificial intelligence affects the business model of delivery in our industry, particularly in some of the white collar or blue collar jobs that perhaps sit in the industry, less about the tradespeople on site. Perhaps in the first instance, I see AI more about knowledge worker reform. I see consultancy, design, surveying, project management, construction management, town planning, all being very, very susceptible to improvement and high productivity gains if we can get that right. And I think that's going to happen, and I think that will be transformative. I think ultimately you will see a world where AI-powered robotics and other technologies change the nature of a construction site. And that's going to bring a really interesting challenge, if you like, to the whole debate about off-site manufacture, prefabrication, because you may see a world in 10 years' time where actually rather than prefabricating as an intermediate process, the construction site is using traditional raw materials, but they're being digitally put together on site through either robotics or augmented working that is actually a lot less expensive than building a factory, or investing in major mass production capability. So I see distributed manufacturing and site assembly powered by technology as being the next potential wave of disruption coming to our industry. And that sounds a bit wacky, but and out there, but I do sense there's a paradigm shift potentially afoot, all depending on how quickly the AI revolution takes hold.
Well, that's a fantastic prediction, one that's certainly close to my own heart. And I would just say it's been really, really interesting to talk to you, Mark. As I mentioned in the lead up to this, I've been waiting quite a long time to go a bit deeper on some of the things that I've seen you talk about publicly, and of course, the report. I just want to thank you again for your time today, Mark. Very generous. And point out to our audience that, as always, notes and references will be added online to our show notes. I want to thank again Dr. Sarah Breen Lovett, our editor-in-chief, and also Michael Hogg for the theme music. And for now, thank you, Mark, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks for inviting me on.
Great.